2 days after the momentous Modi-Xi handshake in Kazan, Russia, there's been a big development along the line of actual control. Disengagement has begun in the two crucial flashpoints of Debsang and Demchowk. Army sources tell India today that China and India will disengage in these two key areas by the end of the month. Our defense correspondents Shivani Sharma and Manjeet Negi with the details.
More than 4 years since the deadly Galwan clashes that derailed India-China ties. The two countries finally began troops disengagement at two friction points, Demchowk and Debsang, along the line of actual control. 5 tents have been removed from both sides at Demchowk, with Indian soldiers moving back to the west side of the Charding Nala, while Chinese soldiers are retreating to the east side of the Nala. There are about 10 to 12 temporary structures and around 12 tents on both sides, all of which are set to be removed. In Debsang, many Chinese vehicles have been removed and number of Indian soldiers reduced. Patrolling is expected to resume in Debsang and Demchowk within the next 4 to 5 days. Sources in army say that disengagement will be completed by 28th to 29th of October.
The army sources have now confirmed that once the disengagement is complete, the patrolling will restart by end of this month. And this time, the patrolling will be done in a coordinated manner to avoid any kind of clashes and confrontations between both the armies. That means that India and PLA will be informing each other before they start their patrolling at these friction points at Demchowk and Debsang plains.
The disengagement operations are being closely monitored.
Broad consensus has been achieved to restore ground situation based on the principles of equal and mutual security. The consensus achieved includes patrolling and grazing to traditional areas. This is the power of engaging in continuous dialogue, because sooner or later solutions will emerge.
During the key bilateral meet between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Xi Jinping in Kazan on October 23rd, the two leaders had welcomed the decision to disengage along the LAC.
सीमा पार पिछले 4 वर्षों में उत्पन्न हुए मुद्दों पर बनी सहमति का हम स्वागत करते हैं। सीमा पर शांति और स्थिरता बनाए रखना हमारी प्राथमिकता रहनी चाहिए। म्यूचुअल ट्रस्ट, म्यूचुअल रिस्पेक्ट और म्यूचुअल सेंसिटिविटी हमारे संबंधों का आधार बने रहना चाहिए।
With the big Ladakh thaw, India and China are looking to put diplomatic ties finally back on track. Shivani Sharma, Bureau Report, India Today.
The first time for us to have a
The big moment internationally this week for India was the bilateral meeting between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping, signaling a thaw after 4.5 years of confrontation along the line of actual control. For a global perspective on the import of this meeting, the way forward between India and China and all the other hot button issues internationally at this moment, I'm joined on NewsTrack by Ian Bremmer, President and founder of the Eurasia Group, one of the world's leading experts on geopolitical risk. Thank you very much, Mr. Bremmer, for joining us.
Sure, my pleasure.
I wish you a very happy Diwali.
Thank you.
I want to start by asking you about your perspective on that big bilateral between Prime Minister Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping. What people in India are trying to determine is why has the People's Liberation Army agreed to pull back at this instance? The kind of disengagement that we're seeing currently in Ladakh is what India has been asking for the past 4.5 years. They didn't agree so far. Why now?
Well, I was just in Beijing a week ago, and I'll tell you it's the worst economically I've seen the Chinese perform in decades. The leadership is aware of it. It is a matter of all of the provincial governments essentially in bankruptcy, real estate sector in collapse. That's about 30% of government revenues, 70% of consumer wealth. The one part of the economy that's really working is manufacturing, But that, of course, is leading to overproduction, which there isn't consumption for inside China, and it's causing political backlash around the world. In other words, this is a time when the Chinese are highly aware of not wanting confrontation geopolitically around the world. That's led to more engagement. It's led to less willingness to be assertive and aggressive and respond with perceived slights with tit for tat. And it's also absolutely the reason why Xi Jinping decided this was the time to reach out to India and to have a very successful bilateral meeting for the first time, as you say, in about 5 years.
The question is what happens next. Even when the PLA ingressed into the Doklam Plateau in Bhutan, the Indian army stood eye to eye. At that time, the Chinese announced that they were pulling back, and it was seen by the government of the day as a big military and diplomatic victory. What happened a few months later, we all know the Chinese came in with such massive force and mobilization that they changed the military composition of the Doklam Plateau forever. And while it was in Bhutan, so it wasn't Indian territory, but then circumstances on the ground really changed. Is this new thaw between Delhi and Beijing going to last in your view? How do we know it's not short-lived?
I don't think that the Chinese have changed their overall long-term strategy, not with India on their contested territory, not with Taiwan or the South China Sea. But for the near term, I mean, in the United States, the equivalent of this, you saw that there is a new Taiwanese president who is very much antagonistic towards the People's Republic of China, has made a bunch of statements, including recently on National Day, that the Chinese have taken vigorous exception to. And yet, the Chinese response has been significantly more restrained than what they did back when Nancy Pelosi, the former Speaker of the House in the U.S., made her trip to Taipei a few years ago. So yet again, this doesn't change China's long-term view of Taiwan, but it absolutely reduces the tensions for now and for the foreseeable future. I think this isn't just a matter of a few months. I think this is probably a few years because China's problems are structural. They're not going to be resolved anytime soon. So in that regard, I do think that there is a real opportunity here, even though we should see the shift as tactical.
How is the evolution of the BRICS bloc being seen internationally and particularly by you? Earlier, the confrontation between India and China would hold most things up. Now, BRICS has been expanded to 9 countries. More countries seem to want to join. Is it tangibly coming together as an alternate to Western institutions, an alternate to Western hegemony over how the world runs? Or do you think it's still as incohesive as it was?
Not exactly, but it's certainly becoming more meaningful. Look, the very fact that these heads of state were all meeting together and that everybody knew that that was a major date on the agenda, certainly that timing is what drove the rapprochement between India and China. One of the most important pieces of geopolitical news all year was facilitated by the BRICS summit. So I think of course, it's newsworthy, it's important. Another point, this summit was hosted by President Putin. He's considered a war criminal by the International Court. And also by the United States and its allies in NATO. And yet, despite that, we had, the entire global South at the highest level, more than happy to show up at Kazan at a meeting that Putin was hosting. I'm not sure they would have all shown up one-on-one for state visits, but there's safety in numbers. And that meant that Putin is a lot less isolated and a lot more capable than he otherwise would have been. And he has the BRICS to thank for that. I think there are other countries in the world that are much more isolated, countries like Venezuela, countries like Iran. And the BRICS summit is one of the few places, certainly the most important multilaterally, where they get to act as members in good standing. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not suggesting that I think all of these are good things, but they are things. They are important things, and they deserve our attention. So for all of those reasons, I think the BRICS summit is becoming more significant.
One of the things BRICS countries, or particularly China and Russia, want to work towards is de-dollarization, figuring out an alternate global currency. India would, of course, never want the yuan to be the global currency of choice. But how do you see that pan out, given sanctions against Russia, the fear of sanctions against countries like China if they were to ever invade Taiwan in the future, and the fact that outside of the Anglosphere, there is a general apprehension about not having too much dependence on the dollar or on the US?
I think that there's a lot more willingness to engage in locally denominated trade around the world, and that has at the margins an effect on the dollar. But overall, the dollar's role in global trade is roughly the same now as it was in the 90s. The bigger shift is that the euro looks a lot weaker, the yen looks a lot weaker, and of course the RMB looks a lot stronger. So I would say that most of the shifts that are happening in the world are not about the erosion of the dollar, but more about the comparative strength and weakness of other countries' currencies. Gold is certainly doing well as a hedge. Crypto is becoming more important, but is still not in any way a substitute for the dollar. Now, the BRICS, you saw, of course, President Putin had a piece of paper that he said, is what a BRICS currency could look like. He can, good luck to him trying to go and buy something with it. But of course, the BRICS as a whole are a large group of countries representing a significant part of the world's population and GDP, but they don't have a lot in common, right? I mean, some of them are authoritarian, some of them are democratic, some in between, some are capitalist, some are state capitalists, some in between, some centrally planned economies too. There's very little that this group actually agrees on geopolitically or strategically. And of course, some of them are very much close to the United States, and some of them are implacable adversaries of the United States. So it is not as if the BRICS are about to become a competitor to or an alternative for the G7. That is not happening, but it certainly is an increasingly important place for countries in the global South to meet.
To what extent was the thawing of relations between China and India influenced by the recent frostiness between Delhi and Ottawa in particular, and also Delhi and Washington on account of Canada and the United States continuing to harbor Khalistani terrorists?
I don't think that was significant. It is certainly true that India and Canada have both played politics. They have the worst relationship among India's bilaterals out there that are meaningful. First, India playing politics with it when this news first became such a big deal. You saw even the Congress party inside India was quite supportive of Modi, of taking a nationalist line against the Canadians. Now, more recently, Trudeau, who is facing his own probably imminent ouster after 10 years of leadership, very unpopular, is using this to curry favor with his own population, Sikh population inside Canada, and that really has hurt. But the the U.S.-India relationship remains quite strong in the context of all of this, both in the context of the Quad, in the context of increasingly upscaling its investments into India, and especially in the technology sector, and also a closening military and national security relationship as India starts relying a lot less on Russia. And so on the military side. So for all of those reasons, I don't see either Canada or the U.S. here playing a significant role in the rapprochement with Xi Jinping.
The biggest X factor in geopolitics at the moment, which could have a bigger role in determining what happens to the world order than anything else, is the presidential elections back home. From the latest polls that I read, it seems Donald Trump is inching ahead. Now, there are two ways of looking at it. One, these are pollsters just being careful. They can see a trend, and therefore they want to ensure that before the polling really takes over, they put Donald Trump in front, so that's the end outcome. The other is he's actually heading for a very clear win, and they're trying to hedge by creating some doubt around the end outcome. What's your sense?
All of the polls for the swing states, and those are the only states that matter in terms of determining the outcome, a small number of states where either candidate is in play, are within the margins of error in the polls. So there's not a lot that you can learn from the polls right now. Structurally, this is an election that is going to be hard for Kamala Harris to win because she is the incumbent, and incumbents all over the world have had a hard time in their elections this year. We've seen that, of course, inside the UK and all over Europe. We've seen it in your country, in India, where Modi is now in a coalition after having governed for 10 years by himself, because people are just less happy with the way their country, the trajectory their country is going. And that's even a country like India with some of the strongest growth in the world, and what you would expect to be a much more satisfied population, but not on the back of the pandemic, not given inflation trends, not given the way the working class is feeling about what is and isn't on their plates. So for all of those reasons, I think this is going to be challenging for Kamala Harris, but Trump is a uniquely unpopular candidate in the U.S. context. In many ways, he's a uniquely unfit candidate. And so I think it's still anybody's guess as to who's going to win in Tuesday, November 5th. The bigger challenge, of course, is that Americans are not prepared to accept the outcome, that so many Americans believe that their candidate has to win or it's been stolen. A lot of disinformation. That's a dangerous place for the country to be. Could lead to a lot of social instability and violence, a lot of uncertainty about the election outcome even after November 5th.
So when it was announced that Kamala Harris would be the Democratic nominee, for a while she was ahead in the polls and it seemed, okay, there's a younger candidate, she could get the large part of the women vote on account of issues like abortion and women's empowerment, but somehow her campaign in the past few days has simply failed to take off. Why is it that she's failing to connect with the American voter and with particularly the undecided voter who will ultimately determine who wins?
The way you put that sounds more dramatic than it actually is. I mean, Biden was seen, and I think appropriately so, as physically incapable of running the country for another 4 years. He did not want to step down. He would have gotten hit by a landslide if he had stayed in. He was basically forced out by the Democrats, by the leaders, by the voters, by the funders, finally gave up the car keys. That led to a huge run of enthusiasm for Kamala Harris, which has reached the ceiling. And that ceiling appears to be about 49% right now in terms of her overall approvals. Trump's appears to be very close to that. Hillary Clinton's was 47, 48. Biden's was 51, 52. So back in 2020. In other words, that is all very, very close. And there aren't a lot of, when you say, why hasn't Kamala Harris's campaign taken off? That implies that she could be at 60 or 70%. That's not possible. The United States is an incredibly divided country, and the number of votes that are actually up for grabs, undecided voters, is incredibly small. That's who they're fighting over every day. Those are the states they keep going back to and back to again. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Nevada, Arizona, a few others. That's it. That's it. And it's a small number of voting districts in those states even. So we are, this is not a breakout possibility for either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump.
You hedged your reply, which you often don't. Who do you think is winning?
Oh, I mean, as I said, I think this is going to be a harder election for Harris to win because 70% of Americans think the country is heading in the wrong direction. So that's really, if you look at, I'm not a U.S. specialist. I'm an international relations specialist. So I look at the U.S. in the context of the rest of the world. There have been an awful lot of elections this year, and they've mostly been unkind to the incumbent. Now, Kamala Harris wasn't the president; she's the vice president, and so she's not as responsible for a lot of these policies. But when she was asked on television, "What would you do differently from Biden?" which is the most important question to be asked in a change election, she said, "No, I can't think of anything I'd do differently." That's the worst possible answer. So I do think that Trump has a small advantage, but I don't feel confident in that is a prediction on the outcome of this election. I feel much more confident that there will be an awful lot of people in the United States that think the election has been stolen, that the new president will be illegitimate. And that's a bigger long-term problem.
Let's shift attention to the Middle East. Israel signaled that it will be attacking Iran after Iran's barrage of missile strikes. But now that Nasrallah and Yahya Sinwar have been killed, is that still likely to happen? We know that Anthony Blinken and others are trying to push back against it. What's your understanding of Netanyahu's mind and the Israel Defense Forces?
Yeah, I think it's still overwhelmingly likely to happen, and the targets are likely to be military targets. In other words, not the energy production and infrastructure of Iran. The U.S. in part has increased sanctions on some of the ships that have been avoiding sanctions so far, and that is important because it reduces Iranian export. And the Americans have worked hard to say that the nuclear facilities should be off the target list, and it looks like the Israeli Prime Minister and his war cabinet have accepted that. But certainly after 180 Iranian missiles have been launched at Israel, no Israelis killed in those attacks, but nonetheless a number of military targets hit. The Israelis are going to respond. So I wouldn't take the fact that a number of weeks have passed to make it seem as if the Israelis will let this one slide. That is not the case.
If and when, as you're suggesting, Israel attacks, will that be the end? Because there was a strike by Israel. It's a very limited strike after the first barrage of missiles, and the Iranians didn't really escalate. Is that where this current round ends, or could it get a whole lot worse?
No, I think you're right. That's where this round ends, but the war's not over. As you know, there are still bombs every day across Gaza. There is an effort to evacuate the north, and then the Israelis make that a no-go zone in Gaza. There's, of course, an active war going on in Lebanon. Hezbollah is far more militarily capable than Hamas, though a lot less than they were a few weeks ago before the war started. That is continuing. You still have 100 Israeli hostages. Most of them are likely dead, being held by Hamas. You still have about 60,000 Israelis that have been evacuated from their homes, over 100,000 from Lebanon, and well over 1 million that have now been displaced. So for all of those reasons, there is a lot of fighting still to play out, but the escalation decisions are being made overwhelmingly by Israel, and that is because they have military dominance in the region. Hezbollah has very little they can do to Israel, to the civilians, to the government, or to the Israeli Defense Forces. That is true for the Iranians as well. It puts Iran in a very difficult position. Their most important deterrent vis-a-vis Israel was Hezbollah on the Israeli border, the most powerful non-state military actor in the world, showing that actually they don't have much fist in their glove when it comes to being able to attack the Israelis. If you're Iran in that environment, you really have two choices. You can either engage more with the Americans and try to normalize relations, become a part of the global economy again, or you can try to develop nuclear weapons. And I think both of those options are things that the Iranians are now considering very seriously.
Do you have any sense of when this conflict in the Middle East could end? Is that even possible to determine? Are we towards the end of what happened post the 7th of October last year, or do you think this could go on for a while?
I think the war in Gaza is near over, at least from the Israeli perspective. I suspect that they will announce an end to major military hostilities unilaterally, irrespective of any agreement or ceasefire with Hamas in the coming weeks. And the reason for that is because they just don't have many more military targets to hit. I mean, they've killed the leadership. They've taken out the tunnels. They've taken out the weapons caches. They've killed enormous numbers of fighters. They've killed enormous numbers of civilians. And so they'll still engage in occasional strikes against targets of opportunity, but that's very different from the war. And you've seen that in the numbers of Palestinians in Gaza that have been killed. It broke through 40,000 a couple of months ago, and the numbers are still going up, but nowhere near at the speed they were when you had an active ground invasion across the territory of Gaza. Most of the ground forces that were in Gaza have now been redeployed. Some of them are home. Some of them are in the north and fighting inside of Lebanon. But that, of course, is not the way the Palestinians see it. From the Palestinian perspective, their land has been destroyed. Their livelihoods no longer exist. And the likelihood that you'll see a lot more radicalism, a lot more terrorism, long-term, generationally, against Israel, against the United States, other targets across the Middle East, and more broadly, I think that is something that we're going to be dealing with for a very, very long time.
Let's lastly shift our attention to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. What impact could the American elections have in the immediate on the course of the war between Russia and Ukraine?
If Trump wins, both candidates want to end the war, but in different ways. Trump would be uninterested in bringing Ukraine into NATO. He would not coordinate his policy easily with the Europeans. He would instead call the Ukrainian leader and the Russian leader directly and say, here's the outcome, this is what I want, end the war or else. Meaning, Ukrainians, you don't get any more support unless you agree to a ceasefire. Russia, you get a lot tougher sanctions unless you agree to a ceasefire. If Kamala Harris wins, then I think there would be an effort to end the war as well, but it would be coordinated through NATO, multilaterally, with the Ukrainians, and then bringing that collective position on a ceasefire to the Russians. So certainly Putin's going to be a lot more comfortable with the Trump win than he would be a Harris win. Zelensky's under a lot more pressure, much harder to get the kind of economic and military support for the Ukrainians going forward, either from the U.S. or the Europeans that they've had over the last 3 years almost. Also harder for the Ukrainians to raise the same level of troops and maintain the fighting commitment that they've had over the last 2.5, almost 3 years now. So for all of those reasons, the Ukrainians will be more highly incented to move towards a ceasefire. Whether the Russians are willing to do so, if they feel like the longer the war goes, the better off they're going to be, that's an open question, and I'm not sure what the answer to that is.
There have been some top international experts who've spoken about how Prime Minister Modi and Erdogan of Turkey are the two leaders most likely to bring Zelensky and Putin to some kind of a agreeable negotiation. Do you share that optimism? The Prime Ministers met with both Zelensky and Vladimir Putin on different occasions this year. Is that at all something that could happen, or do you think that's really not so much in the realm of actual realization?
I think that they're both options. I also think that Mohammed bin Salman from Saudi Arabia would be an option. I think that the Secretary General of the UN, who facilitated the Black Sea grain deal and also a number of prisoner exchanges, Antonio Guterres, I think he would be an option. So I think there are lots of ways and lots of interlocutors that could potentially facilitate an agreement between the Russians and Ukrainians, but they have to both be willing to sit down and talk, and we have not been at that point thus far. After the elections, I think it's possible. But, the fact that you mentioned Modi is interesting here because, of course, one thing that we've seen from the BRICS summit is that India today is perhaps in the best geopolitical position overall of almost any major country in the world today. The India relationship with the United States, with the Europeans, with the Japanese, extremely strong. At the same time, the Indians are a natural leader of the global South, and we saw that when they were chairing the G20 just a couple of years ago. The India relationship with China, which of course is their leading trade partner, has now been stabilized from the bilateral meeting that was successful between Modi and Xi. And finally, of course, the fact is that India has done a lot more trading with Russia, buying a lot more oil from Russia, radically more since the war started. That relationship is reasonably strong and trusted, and yet there's been very little backlash internationally against India from the West, despite the fact that China's relations with Russia have been a focus of very significant scrutiny and criticism. So, I mean, I do think, I know that since I'm talking to you from India, you'd find that interesting. That is my assessment of where.
Is that just happenstance or sharp? Is that happenstance or just time and place, or sharp diplomatic maneuvering from the powers that be in Delhi at the moment?
Oh, no, it's absolutely both. I mean, you need to have a geopolitical environment that allows for you to act as a leader, act as a bridge. But it's also true that being a stable leader for more than 10 years now, with 5 more in the future, is, especially in a democracy, is a decidedly unusual thing to have happen. Most leaders are very unpopular of democracies these days. And while Modi has suffered a bit of a disappointment in his last election and governs in a coalition, his coalition partners are regional parties that don't have any particular truck with foreign policy at all. So internationally, Modi is still seen as the same pair of hands that he's been for over a decade now, and someone that really wants to be a friend of pretty much everyone, not Pakistan, certainly not Canada today, but pretty much everyone around the world.
Our Foreign Minister Jaishankar went to the meeting in Islamabad, after which there was a lot of talk of whether it could lead to something bigger. Do you think there's a back channel discussion which could yield results, or do you think this is just going through the motions because it's a multilateral forum with very little end outcome likely?
I think it's largely this is a multilateral forum and this is why you have a meeting, but it certainly didn't seem very friendly. Look, I mean, Jaishankar I've known for many, many years. I knew him back when he was ambassador to Washington as well. He is one of the most capable foreign ministers on the global stage today. Almost everyone thinks that about him. And so if anyone was going to pull it off, it would be him. It is unclear to me that is an area of great focus and priority for him and for the Indian government in the context of everything else going on.
We leave it over there. Ian Bremmer, always a masterclass in where things stand on the international table when you join us on the NewsTrack. Thank you so much for taking our time.
Good to see you. My pleasure.